Hi there, welcome to another episode of From Ireland to Palestine. Today's guest is Jonathan Purcell, who's Senior Public Affairs and Communication Officer for the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, the ICJP. They're a group of lawyers, academics, politicians who work to support Palestinian rights, mainly on the legal front. So they're holding to account many of the complicit institutions and governments that are involved in Israel's genocide in Gaza. They've also done a lot of brilliant work helping smaller groups like ourselves, BDS Belfast. So we're delighted to have Jonathan on today to talk about their work. Jonathan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you. So maybe just start by telling us a bit about the history of the ICJP, their general work, what do you do, and what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So as you said, our main objective and mode of operating essentially is to work through the law to support the rights of Palestinians. And in terms of its history, we were founded in 2021, but really our history sort of goes back to 2009, as it were, because our director, Taib Ali, he founded the Centre in 2021, and that was in relation to Israel's escalation in that year. But what he recognized essentially was that this had been happening, every couple of years, essentially. You can look back to 2014, 2009, the Second Intifada, all the way back to 48 and well before that. And this cycle of impunity was what was causing this to be happening year on year. So really, he realized it was too late, maybe in 2021, to create an impact, but knew sadly that it was simply just a matter of time until the next escalation would happen. And it was unimaginable that it would be the scale of genocide that we've seen. But we knew that the suffering would be as acute, simply just not the scale. So in many ways, it's just as well that it was then that we were founded. But yeah, when I say really the roots of it go back to 2009, and that's because Taib, who's a solicitor, he in his career in 2009 was part of the team that successfully applied for arrest warrants for then Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, and that was in relation to that escalation. And it caused a significant diplomatic incident. At the time, it was very unprecedented, and I don't think the British political establishment really knew how to respond, because at that time, that sort of legal advocacy to advocate for Palestinian rights was somewhat novel. But that really is where the foundation of the idea of ICJP was born, and since 2021, it's only grown from there.
And what about your own role within the ICJP? What do you typically
Yeah,
do?
sure. So I run the public affairs and communications team at the organization. So even though we are mainly legal led, he was speaking to one of the few non-lawyers at the institute, but what we do in terms of supporting the legal team is, on the one side, the public affairs and policy aspect of it. So that's lobbying the British government, lobbying parliamentarians in the UK and elsewhere to firstly simply adhere to international humanitarian law, ensure that the UK is upholding its own obligations in relation to international law, and as a result, protects Palestinian rights and break Israeli impunity. Then, as well as the political side of things, we also run the communications and press. So that's amplifying the legal work of the centre, working with journalists to ensure that there's coverage of the fact that there is this advocacy work that is happening, despite all of the awful news of the genocide, and trying to get some of that coverage published as much as one can, with the media environment being the way that it is in the UK and the West more broadly.
Yeah, no, we've had that with previous guests, just the struggle to get anything done with like the likes of Chris AG and was a publisher for Avi Shlaim's book and the difficulty they had getting things published in England versus Ireland. It's a pretty common theme. What what about the funding for the ICJP? Obviously, we for right wing think tanks, they're often very uh, very careful about guarding the information about who funds them, and people sometimes come down on them for that. So it's probably best we're transparent about how organisations that support our side, if you like, are funded. How does the ICJP raise its money?
Yeah, so I mean, again, it's private funding. We don't take any grants. We're not tied to any, government or organization that might try to influence us in that way, which is why we don't take any grants. It's all private funds. And since October 2023 as well, the amount of grassroots fundraising has increased a lot, which is really nice to see that, and it just reinforces the point that there is this total divorce between the governments and the people within those countries, because you can see the grassroots swelling support in the streets. You can see it in, funding good causes as well. And yet the government is just totally at odds with that.
Yeah, I think it's been a massive exposure of how little democracy really exists throughout the West when you have entire populations more or less against this, and yet there's no political representation of that. I think it's an eye opener for everyone who's been involved with this beyond just the Palestine issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's Palestine is, people often say that it's a microcosm or a bellwether of the larger debates at play here, but certainly in the UK and in other countries too, you can see all sorts of civil liberties being eroded, some of which play into Palestine in terms of the policing of protests, and some of which affect completely unrelated campaigns. But it's simply the principle, of freedom of assembly, of freedom of expression. It's something that's under threat in the UK. It's obviously under threat in the US, and given the UK's relationship and many other Western countries too, that knock-on effect is just so clear.
Yeah, it's maybe something we'll get into. Yeah, but it's not just international law that's being violated; it's British law as well, which is being undermined by all this. Just in terms of funding, again, do you crowdfund your legal campaigns as well, like for like specific individual campaigns? Would you get crowdfunding from those?
Yeah, we do. So we have that on our websites. You can donate directly to ICJP, and we've got it on our social media channels as well, on Twitter and Instagram. So, if there's so many good causes to donate to on Palestine, and very important, direct and urgent ones in terms of humanitarian provision. But yeah, if people are interested in the longer term projects of accountability and holding people to justice, then that's available to you.
Yeah, maybe these things don't happen in the first place if the powerful are held better to account. You were telling me beforehand that you had sort of a background in looking at what you described as suspect communities or suspect populations. So you were drawing a link, I think, between the Irish community in Britain in the 1980s, when there was what was described as IRA terrorism during that period, and then and comparing that to, the fear around Islamist terrorism to today, and the suggested threat from Muslims. Do you want to go into that a little bit? I mean, I have my own experiences of that, even from being in university or living in England in the late 90s, early 2000s. You were immediately treated with suspicion merely for having an Irish accent, and there were always jokes about terrorism and even about like the potato famine and things. So it was a very real thing up until quite recently, but it's now switched to Muslims, it seems.
Yeah. I mean, I would not be one to tell you about the lived experience of it by any sense. But yeah, in terms of this, so yeah, this was a lot of research I did in my academic days, and yeah, initially what I was looking at was media depictions in particular of the Irish community in the 1980s in the British press. And there's a great archive, the Irish in Britain archive in London, London Metropolitan University, has a lot on this, particularly the political cartoons can be particularly aggressive caricatures, but just the language and framing more broadly in the media, but also this is what I specialized in, but beyond that, in politics and in culture more widely. And yeah, my parents moved to the UK in 1986, and they had their Irish number plate because they brought the car over. And they were talking about how regularly they would be getting stopped whilst driving around simply for having the Irish plates, which is astounding. And they made the point as well that, you know, you wouldn't be particularly clandestine or effective if you were so inclined. If you were going to be using Irish plates, it doesn't really make sense anyway. But even so, you know, it's shocking. And that was the idea that with the prevention of terrorism architecture that was brought in 1974, and it's something that we've seen again in the early 2000s and even more recently with amendments to it, which relates more acutely to Palestine. But the way in which that prevention of terrorism legislation then seeps into the public consciousness in terms of politics and media is very clear. And then, yeah, there was this shift in the 2000s. This concept of the suspect community was brought forward by Paddy Hilliard in an Irish context initially, and was then applied to the Muslim population in Britain, which again is not a perfect parallel, because obviously this is now talking about a religious group rather than an ethnic group. And again, it seems bizarre because, you know, there are Muslims from all corners of the world and they don't necessarily look a certain way, but this isn't the way that it's perceived in at least the security infrastructure in Britain, you know, which means that non-Muslims are targeted because of Islamophobic purposes, and it has this obscure and confusing mix of religious and racial elements, which again is something quite different to actually the suspect community that was constructed with the Irish, because as you said, it was, you know, the experiences you had was when people heard you speak. I have a very different experience in Britain compared to other second generation immigrants, because people don't assume necessarily that my parents are Irish. They'd have no way of knowing because I'm white. And that's the sort of interesting way that the suspect community has changed over time. And it means that not that a targeted approach would be acceptable, but it's even more arbitrary and bizarre that you have this sort of securitization of such an abstract and ethereal group. But, you know, with 2001 and in the UK as well, 2005 and 7/7, that's when it really became entrenched. But we see it now, the way that Palestinian protests are policed, which is in part due to ethnic diversity of those protesting, is so different to, and that they're peaceful protests, so different to the way that violent protests and riots that we've seen by far-right protesters outside migrant hotels, which are predominantly white protesters, are not treated in the same way. And the far-right often has this laughable term of two-tier policing, and two-tier policing definitely does exist, but in the exact opposite way that they imply. And, you know, it's peaceful protesters that are being targeted with such punitive measures for voicing pro-Palestinian sentiments. And there is this sort of link, that goes all the way back, which is why it's so interesting to be talking on a podcast, you know, approaching Ireland and Palestine and that special relationship.
Yeah, it is striking that difference in how protests are policed. I was talking to someone from Germany at the weekend. They were over from Munich, and I was saying the policing must be really bad there, and they said it generally is, but it's not so bad in Munich. A lot of the footage we'd see in Germany of, you know, really excessive force being used by police in protest is in Berlin. And I asked, is that maybe because it's close to the seat of power and it's a bit like the Met in London? Maybe they crack down because it's a bit closer to Westminster. One factor. But they said the main factor is just it's more ethnically diverse. It's a larger immigrant population in Berlin, and that's what really sets them off and causes them to crack down there. And it's the Islamophobia is so overt today. Like I was just thinking of some examples like Boris Johnson's reference to Muslim women looking like letterboxes, and Rod Liddle saying that the problem with the Conservative Party is there's not enough Islamophobia. You can imagine what that would have been if he'd said there's not enough anti-Semitism. It would have been he would have lost his job. Paper probably would have been closed down. So it's a real striking fact that it's kind of like an acceptable prejudice, Islamophobia. And we've had decades of it, and the decades of that is similar to the centuries of anti-Semitism we had that led to the Nazi Holocaust. And now, I think in quite a similar way, decades of Islamophobia and a negative characterization of Arabs has led to another Holocaust in Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the UK, it's astounding. Boris Johnson's a great example of that term about the total degree of dehumanization against the Muslim population in the UK, including British Muslims. There's this total obscene idea of, mixed loyalties, or the idea that a British Muslim can't exist at all. And again, it just shows how racialized this approach to migration is. Again, I'm never met with these accusations that I can't assimilate simply because I come from a Roman Catholic background or because my parents are immigrants. And it just really lifts the veil, I think, on how absurdly racist and Islamophobic all of these things are.
Yeah. I mean, there has been I think there probably has been a shift, even if it was relatively recent past. There was a lot of hostility and racism towards Irish people. It maybe has shifted a bit. There's maybe like a new generation, like what you might call the kneecap generation in England, or the Colston generation, who are maybe a bit more progressive and a bit, I mean, you couldn't have imagined 20 years ago a rap group wearing, tricolour bandanas could be received so warmly in England. That is a signal of a shift, at least among the younger generation, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And I think perhaps part of that is sort of the democratization of history and education that's come from social media as well, because I was brought up in a British educational system, and I did history throughout school. I did it for my university degree as well. And so I do feel like I have a full understanding of the way history is taught in this country. And, you have the Tudors and the Second World War ad infinitum. And when you have the Second World War, it's not about the UK infringing on the neutrality of Iceland when it unlawfully invaded it in 1944. Who knows about that? No one. Mm-hmm. It's about Dunkirk, and even then, not portrayed as a defeat, but as a tactical genius and propaganda victory. Yeah. Whereas now, people speak to me all the time because they know I did Irish history a lot when I was younger, and they say, I never knew this. I was never taught about this in school, and I've only looked into it because of kneecap. And the Irish language, as well as the history, all of these things are new to people. So there's lots of British people that don't even know the Irish language exists. It's that level of lack of education, and that's deliberate. It's by design.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it is really, really striking. I'm just going to move back on to the ICJP's work here again. It isn't just a strategy you pursue. It seems to be kind of like a dual track approach you take. It's like a sort of it's not all direct sort of legal attack. There are some instances where you take out cases against the government, for example, but there's also just a lot of letting people know you're there sort of things, like kind of like the work you've done with BDS Belfast, where it's just sort of letting someone know you're on notice. Is that kind of the dual thing? You have some actual action to say, look, we can take action if we need to, but then a large portion of your work sort of awareness raising and just letting people know that they could be held to account?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. And the thing is, complicity is everywhere. So the government is complicit in a plethora of ways, in terms of its stance on Palestine, from, the most obvious, the likes of sales of arms and potential military complicity in terms of flights, but also, supermarkets are complicit, and BDS Belfast does a great job of illustrating this, in terms of not necessarily adhering to the highest guidelines in terms of labeling illegal settlement goods and having the processes in place to ensure that that's not happening. And if they are selling settlement goods that they have failed to do the due diligence on labeling, then that is an element of their complicity as well. And when it comes to even arm's length organizations, in tangent to government, such as the Charity Commission, it's their responsibility to ensure that charities are not in the law in terms of raising funds for sanctioned organizations that uphold the illegal occupation as well. So I think that there is complicity everywhere you look. It's just so embedded, and that's because of the strong relationship that Britain and Israel has had over decades. And that's why I think the ICJP at least tries to leave no stone unturned. We look for it everywhere, and we let people know that we're there everywhere. And yeah, an aspect of it is sometimes ignorance. So it can be as simple as informing an organization, and then measures are put in place. Other times you have to be more forceful with your arguments and with your legal tactics.
Yeah, I suppose it's a bit, if you can be that widespread, it's a little bit like the what's sometimes referred to as like the electric fence tactic of the Zionists, which means that anytime anyone sort of steps out of line and gets too close to criticizing Israel, they get sort of a short, sharp shock from the electric fence propaganda wall that they have protecting them. I suppose if the ICJP could be something like an equivalent to that, but a more honest one for Palestinians, and that's a useful function.
The one thing that you can say about the Israeli lobby is there's a lot to learn in terms of the professional approach of the outfit.
Yeah, they're pretty robust for that. There's nothing wrong with learning from your enemies as long as you don't repeat exactly what they're doing in terms of their crimes. Just, you were going through a few examples there of British. I always like to say participation rather than complicity, because I think it goes a step beyond mere complicity. Do you want to maybe list off as many ways as you know that Britain is complicit? People maybe know the big ones, like there's the obvious constant diplomatic and to some extent military support. Well, quite a lot of military support, but there's other things like you mentioned, the charity aspect, IOF soldiers who are British, other things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a big part of ICJP's work is, as you mentioned, with IOF soldiers, ensuring that dual citizens are held accountable, and we have a specific project called Global 195, where we have partners in jurisdictions across the world, in nearly every continent, where we partner with lawyers who file within their jurisdiction every time there is a dual national of Israel and that respective country that is then back in their sovereign territory. Many countries have explicit legislation that they could be pursuing in terms of holding these soldiers accountable, where they have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity. But there's either at best a lack of information, and at worst an unwillingness to pursue these. And the UK is no exception to that. There are lots and lots of documentation of dual national British-Israeli citizens who have operated in Gaza, and part of our work is, collecting evidence and supplying it to various organizations, Scotland Yard, the ICC, in terms of ensuring that that happens. So yeah, that's a big part of it. But as well as that, there's a really broad scope, as you say. So in terms of the UK being a signatory to the Genocide Convention, as a third party, it has a positive obligation to prevent and punish genocide in that regard. So this is actually a really, really low bar. It's, a lot of critics say that genocide hasn't been explicitly established in the South Africa case. But if the question is about preventing genocide rather than just punishing it, then that's irrelevant. So any way in which the UK supports a country that could plausibly be committing genocide, which is so easy to argue, and the ICJ has deemed that, then anything from, the continuation of trade agreements, not sufficiently putting in legislation on ensuring that there's not economic support for Israeli settlements. So when we go back to supermarkets, right now, the UK government has guidelines rather than any explicit law to try ensure that supermarkets are not complicit as well. That's a failing from the UK government. Another one is insufficient sanctions on ministers. So right now it's just Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. And even then, it's in their personal capacities, which is such a strange and peculiar way of going about it. That could be in their formal capacities, and it could be many other ministers as well, right up to the very top, to Netanyahu too. And also the UK, as an ICC state party, needs to ensure that it is fulfilling its state party duties in that regard too. So that includes upholding ICC arrest warrant charges. So if Gallant and Netanyahu come to the UK, it is the UK's obligation to arrest them. They've not committed affirmatively to do that. And the ICC really does need the protection of its state parties right now, because we've seen the US sanction senior ICC officials. There were actually 4 more individuals sanctioned earlier this week. And also there's long-standing examples of Israeli intimidation of the ICC. Even the previous prosecutor, Fatih Bensouda, the Mossad chief, was found to be threatening her as well. So the ICC needs protection and bravery from state parties such as the UK, and yet it's not forthcoming.
Mm. Yeah, there's been a lot of reports about that recently, about the intimidation that goes on at the ICC, like that there were potential arrest warrants upcoming for Smotrich and Ben-Gvir for apartheid, but the suspicion those were formulated under Karim Khan, I think, but then he got shuffled off under suspicious circumstances, and it seems like the current crop of people at the ICC maybe don't want to take those on because of the fear of sanctions and just a general climate of intimidation.
Yeah, this is the reports that have come out, and it's unsurprising that there are arrest warrants waiting to go on apartheid, given the ICJ's advisory opinion last year, reiterating explicitly the illegality of the occupation. But what seems so strange to me is that if the US is continuing to sanction senior ICC officials anyway, then the threat of sanctions should no longer be influencing them in terms of not releasing the warrants. If you've been sanctioned now, then that's the time. There's nothing to lose, really, right? And there needs to be bravery from the ICC. But what is the point in an international rules-based order if it doesn't stand up at the time where it's needed most? And I think later you were planning on talking more specifically about that, so I'll leave it there for now. But it is a really interesting question to ask.
Yeah. Just briefly going back to the case of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Britain, personally, for whatever that's worth, I suspect they're not sanctioning them for their formal role, because anything they sanctioned them for in their formal role would be something Britain was involved in too. So it'd be almost tantamount to sanctioning yourself. Ben-Gvir said, well, you were helping us with that. Why are you sanctioning me? You participated in that with your spy flights or with your F-35s or whatever else. So I suspect that's the reason why Britain is so reluctant to sanction in a formal capacity the likes of those ministers.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I think there's probably a whole host of ways that the UK government has tied itself up with its previous actions, where it may be looking to backtrack, and it may be very difficult to do so in a clean manner. That might be one of them.
All the reasons, yeah. And just about the problems we were talking about there with international law as a whole, I mean, we had, I was mentioning before we went on, Shad Hamori on, who's very critical of just the very foundations of international law, views them as sort of Eurocentric and not really adhering to sort of basic notions of justice at all, about taking in things like the rights of previously colonized people and just basic human, like a more expanded concept of people's rights, I suppose, to right to peace and a right to things like healthcare and housing and that sort of thing. That could come under the rubric of international law, but it never does. So she's very critical of it. Whereas interviews I've seen with your director Tayyab Ali, he takes a bit of a different tack. He says the laws are fine. In fact, I think I heard him say the laws are excellent. They're just not being enforced. So is that more or less the position of the ICJP? The laws are fine, but just enforcement's the issue?
I think it's a mixture of the two, and I think Tayyab would say the same. To be fair, I mean, essentially, the logic of the international rules-based order, theoretically, is to apply international law equally without fear or favor. And certainly at the beginning of the genocide, that was what ICJP was advocating for, and that's what it was calling on the ICC to do. And if international law was applied equally without fear or favor, there would be no genocide. It is as simple as that. But it comes down to the fact that the real power makers, I mean, it's unavoidable to you have to accept that these institutions were created in a post-Second World War context by the victors. So it inherently correlates not only to great powers, but to Western powers specifically. And while it may have held in a post-war context to some degree, it was never without its problems. There's been a lot of critiques historically that the ICC has taken, a racist approach in terms of targeting African war criminals in a way that it doesn't with other parts of the world. So these are not new discussions, but I think the degree of how outrageous the hypocrisy is has just reached new heights now, and Palestine has highlighted the issue stronger than anything that came before. And then you look at the countries that are taking forward major cases at the ICJ, the ones that are leading the way and actually holding those global north powers to account on their own laws are the likes of South Africa and of Nicaragua as well. And that is where there's this palpable shift, where there's a realization amongst the global majority, and particularly amongst former colonized people, that this is total hypocrisy from the Western powers. And you can recognize that and still also recognize that state parties that have agreed to the ICC's rules therefore have to apply them as well. because that is its own internal logic too. So I don't think that those two positions are mutually incompatible.
Mm. Yeah, I suppose it is striking, like you say, the previous examples of the ICC only often sanctioning African leaders, and Karim Khan himself was apparently told by a U.S. politician that, the court, this is what the court's for. It's just for sanctioning African dictators. That's, you should don't step out of line and start going after Israeli leaders. Do you think the way around it in the meantime, in terms of getting something done on these things, is by things like the Hague Group? That's something else Shah Tamori was involved in, and just trying to build a power base sort of separate to the great powers, and separate to, well, not exactly separate to international law, but as another sort of pressure point on it. Things like groups of those states coming together and trying to bring their own sanctions to bear against Israel.
Yeah, I think it's a powerful approach, and I can totally understand why countries may feel that, it's beyond reform and really something new needs to be built from the ground up. I think that, like I say, I think that what the Hague Group is doing is fantastic in that regard, and equally, it's important to acknowledge the existing ICC arrest warrants too, and make sure that they're applied as well. And I think these multiple approaches are exactly what we need to be trying to find accountability on a global level.
Yeah. And in terms of Britain itself, it sort of feels like things are moving in the wrong direction in terms of law being a vehicle for justice, with the prescription of Palestine action. Is that something the ICJP are involved in fighting at all?
Yeah, so I think that what's so outrageous about this, it's not a question of whether one supports or disagrees what the organization is doing. It comes down to the principles of freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. And, you asked earlier about ways that the UK was breaking laws in terms of its association with Israel. But domestically too, the erosion of civil liberties is totally at odds with existing legislation that exists in the UK. And this most recent prescription doesn't come in a vacuum. It may be a whole new level again, but like what has been happening in recent years in the UK with the Public Order Acts, with the Police and Sentencing Act, and now with the Criminal Justice Bill as well, which is looking to ban the use of face coverings at protests, ban the climbing of monuments at protests. It is part of that process to undermine any challenge to authority in an increasingly punitive atmosphere. And the use of whether or not anyone agrees with the actions of Palestine Action or not, it's clear that, this is the misuse of terrorism legislation is absolutely egregious by the UK government. And it comes back to what I was talking about at the very start. The misuse of terrorism legislation is not something that the UK government, it's not a new idea from the UK government. It goes back to the 1974 Prevention of Terror Act, and it's been used many times since then against many groups.
Yeah, and it was warned. Even the latest version of it, which was it 2000 or so, was brought in. It was people warned at the time because it included property damage. It would be misused eventually, and that's what happened. They've sort of caught Palestine Action for that part of it. They haven't been involved in this one incident where they're alleged to be some kind of a scuffle with someone, but other than that, it's been all property damage.
Yeah, you can look back through Hansard, and there's parliamentary scrutiny, especially in the Lords. I think the Lords often likes to get into this level of details that specifically asks that point in relation to the Terrorism Act in 2000, and assurances were made that it would not be misused in that manner. But of course, if there's not checks and balances beyond verbal assurance, then 25 years later, it's very difficult to predict whether those promises will be kept by a different government.
Yeah. I mean, trust us, we're the government isn't really a solid basis for proceeding on. I think it's something journalists would do well to think of too, is to assume that governments are lying in the first place, or shouldn't be trusted in the first place, where it's the opposite in the media. They assume the government's telling them the truth and go from there. And just in terms of how it sort of undermines politics as a whole, it seems that seems to be the case with laws like that, because it's ordinarily you'd have politics proceeding in the ideal case in a more civilized way. You'd have open discussion about things. Certain ideas wouldn't be banned, but as soon as you move towards banning discussion of things, which is the case with Palestine Action, you're not even allowed to express your support for them anymore, and it sort of restricts assembly around that to some extent as well. You sort of push everything in a direction of a more aggressive and potentially violent direction, because people say, well, if I can't express myself in a conventional way anymore, I'm just going to do something more radical. So it's sort of, and you see that in the most authoritarian countries, the only form of politics people can practice, because everything's suppressed, is violent rebellion. So what Britain's currently doing is it's not there yet, but it's pushing things in that direction.
I mean, yeah, first of all, I think when you criminalize, and you can look at, even lesser than the actions of Palestine Action, even less direct action, when you look at the approach towards other protests, both the previous government and the current government, in terms of heavy policing, I think it shows that you've lost the argument. And it highlights again what I was saying earlier, that the UK government is so out of step with the British population. And yeah, if you do criminalize peaceful protests, if individuals like the former Home Secretary refer to hate marches in relation to November 2023, then it's very difficult to know what approach people can take. If you're telling them peaceful protest is wrong, then what's right? Surely in a democracy, there's got to be a way to articulate your disagreements against government. But increasingly, that space seems to be closing.
Yeah. And just in north of Ireland and Belfast generally, we kind of notice the temperature being dialed up around protests. The far right are more and more sort of drawing a battle line between themselves and Palestine groups. And I think that's only reinforced by government rhetoric and laws saying that we're what we're doing is illegal, or what we're doing is supporting Hamas, or whatever. The rhetoric is pushing a sort of violent conflict between us and these groups, when it needn't be the case. It could be everyone's protesting peacefully.
Yeah. I mean, there's the depictions, and again, this comes back to not just the political class, but the media class too. The way in which peaceful protest is portrayed is so far from the truth, and there is an idea that is trying to be pushed by the media establishment that Palestinian protesters may be violent, or whatever insinuation they have. And of course, it's simply not true, but it's just, again, part of trying to silence dissent.
Yeah. I think one thing that might come out of this that's positive is I suspect there's a good chance this law will be defeated, maybe under judicial review or maybe just under public pressure. But when that happens, it's quite an inflection point potentially for popular movements, because it's going to show people that if you really want to, you can disobey the government when it comes out with crappy laws, or you can really achieve major things if enough people mobilize together. So there's potential that the government should really shot itself in the foot with this ultimately, because it's like it's a radicalizing moment.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how the court case plays out, but it certainly seems like a knee-jerk reaction from the government, even in a, not in a political interpretation or anything, but it seems like bad law. It was rushed, ill-judged. It seems like a massive overreach of what the Terrorism Act was implemented to prevent, and therefore, it would be interesting to see if it does get overturned, and it certainly should be overturned. And yeah, we'll wait and see, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. Just moving back again to your own work at the ICJP. Do you work with Hind Rajab Foundation at all?
Yeah, so we have done some work with Hind Rajab before, and we do very, in many ways, similar work, especially in relation to IDF soldiers on an individual level, and that level of trying to seek accountability within domestic jurisdictions. And I think it's important that as many groups as possible are trying to do this. And because the scale of it is just so large. And so, yeah, we have this Global 195 umbrella that we have, and separately, Hind Rajab does similar things in other countries. I think it was in Belgium recently, they had some successes as well. So, yeah, these kind of ideas about using the law to ensure accountability, I think as many organizations as possible need to be doing it, because the scale required is just so massive.
Yeah, and we've had a bit of contact with the Hind Rajab Foundation before when Israelis have come to Belfast. We reckon we could identify some of them, and we wanted to find out if it was possible to potentially make a citizen's arrest on them. And we contacted Hind Rajab Foundation, and they seemed a bit sketchy about that. It seems like they prefer to work through conventional channels, but you're not always going to get results from that. You're potentially up against the same kind of problems we discussed with international law, that there's just not the will to enforce these things. I mean, what do you think about that? About the role? I mean, you help activist groups like BDS Belfast. What do you think of the role of Hind Rajab's Foundation stance on that, and just the potential role activist groups could have in enforcing these things when governments don't do it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. To be honest, it's not something, as far as I'm aware, our legal team has looked at, and will certainly not proceed. And given that I'm not a lawyer, I couldn't speculate to that regards, to be honest. But I think that I appreciate, like, there's so much frustration and desire to ensure that there is this accountability. But I think at the same time, we need to make the cases to governments that this is their responsibility as well. And I think that's certainly why we take our approach. I don't know about HRF, but yeah, that is what I would say.
Yeah. Although you do a lot of work with activist groups, don't you? I mean, you've worked obviously with BDS Belfast. Is that a common thing for you to work with? Sort of, we're a relatively small group for smaller activist groups, and just provide help to them. And is that something you would encourage people to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think mainly, the movement requires many different strings to the bow, and everyone is pushing in their own way. I think the way that we help activist groups most is trying to ensure that this space isn't closed in domestic legislation, and ensuring that groups continue to have the right to protest in the way that they wish. So, like, for instance, ICJP was part of a coalition in the last government, and there were lots of organizations pushing against this. We were simply one, but it was the anti-boycott bill, which, was trying to prevent local councils from being able to boycott Israeli investments, which was particularly relevant in terms of pensions. And it had an even more ridiculous sort of gagging clause in the way that not only would it have made it illegal, but also any member of a local council could not even have said, hypothetically, if this law did not exist, we would boycott Israel. So it created this weird double layer of a lack of freedom of expression, essentially. And, fighting against that in a political capacity is, something that we do. And then hopefully that allows organizations to then continue to do their important work as well. And I think that's kind of the way that things work together, in truth. There's some examples, especially when there's very galvanized parts of Britain and the north of Ireland in BDS Belfast's case. Belfast, of course, is you're doing such great work there, and we want to support that because it's so great. And that's something that you've been working on for years, and we're simply trying to help where we can. But it's so yeah, in instances where it is like that, then more than happy to. But yeah, it just depends on the situation.
Yeah, so it's a large, and it's about opening up space, I suppose, for these groups, and then where there's an opening, you can come in and provide additional support. So I suppose we're just wrapping up here in the final couple of questions. I mean, what are the big things in the pipeline for the ICJP, and maybe if you just want to talk about any notable successes you've had going, which is always kind of useful for people to have in these sometimes demoralizing times.
Yeah. I don't know if big things in the pipeline was an intentional pun by you, but I'm going to capitalize on it anyway. But the big thing in the pipeline is actually a pipeline, which is the Baku to Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. And that runs from Azerbaijan through Georgia and into Turkey. And from Turkey, the crude oil is then shipped directly to Israel. And it's known as the BTC pipeline, and the BTC Corporation and BP Oil runs that pipeline. So ICJP is looking to, well, is currently working on taking forward a case against BP Oil in that regard. So we launched this case in December last year. But as you can imagine, these legal processes are slow for such major legal challenges as that. But I'd say that that's certainly something to continue keeping an eye on. These cases take years. It's not going to be a quick resolution. But, this is a company with significant British links that is supplying 28% of crude oil to Israel through a single pipeline. And the importance of that oil in funding the Israeli war efforts and in turn the genocide is so significant. So I think that is a really, really major one. In terms of successes, I mean, there's things that ICJP can claim a portion of the work towards achieving. I think that the beauty of our side is that it's such a collaborative space, and people are not doing anything for glory, but for actual justice. So we don't necessarily have a trophy cabinet of all the things that we deem as our successes, but I think that given that our immediate focus after the beginning of the genocide was collecting witness evidence statements that we supplied Scotland Yard and the ICC, that the ICC arrest warrants, we're really proud of the evidence that we were able to supply in order to ensure that they were issued. And, to have the Prime Minister of Israel, as well as the ex-defense minister, have an arrest warrant issued against them is such a big symbolic, one of the biggest, symbolic moments since the beginning of the genocide. And hopefully not only a symbolic moment, but eventually, if he does go to an ICC state party country and that particular state party is brave enough to arrest him, hopefully it's beyond symbolism as well. So yeah, I would say that's the big one. But again, there's other things too. I spoke about the anti-boycott bill that didn't pass in the end, and that's an important one. And the domestic situation, there's organizations and universities, colleges that have divested from their investments in Israeli settlements and in arms exports to Israel, arms industry that have contracts with Israel as well. So, it feels like a drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the genocide. But yeah, like you say, these small wins, they may feel insignificant, but you need to acknowledge them when they come as well.
Yeah. I have to say, I had heard of the pipeline, but I wasn't aware that you were working on that. So that was an unintended reference there. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, no, worked well in the end.
Yeah. That's
probably
interesting.
the only joke you've had or will have on this podcast, and even then, only a little one. But
exactly. Yeah, and that's pretty serious times. There's not much room. Well, we might have to take Hickey on at some point, and that might be a bit more humorous. But yeah. And in terms of your what you're saying there about the wins, that's an important reminder that all this is collective. Like, we're all working together for the same end, so none of us can really claim with the sole responsibility for anything. But I think everything you're doing, everything we're all doing, is part of a wider shift towards hopefully a more just world and more justice for the Palestinians. So please keep on what you're doing, Jonathan. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, and likewise, keep on with what you're doing. Really appreciate a really interesting chat. Thanks so much for having me on.
No problem. Thanks again.
All right, all the best.